There is something that has followed you your entire life. Not a shadow exactly, not a disease. Something older than either of those words. A kind of aliveness that sits just beneath your skin, raw, exposed, trembling at the edges of things other people walk past without noticing. A bird dies on the road and something in you does not recover for days. A piece of music rises in a minor key and suddenly you are weeping without knowing why. Someone raises their voice in a crowded room and your body understands it as threat before your mind even registers that voices were raised. You feel the temperature of a room the moment you enter it. You know when something is wrong before anyone has said a word. You have always been like this, and for most of your life you were told this was a problem. They had many names for it. Too sensitive, too emotional. You take things too personally. You need to toughen up. You can't keep living like this. And so you tried. You built a self that could function, efficient, composed, capable of sitting through meetings and birthday parties and dinner conversations without bleeding all over the floor. You learned to fold the thing down like a letter you were not allowed to send. You got very good at it, and you told yourself it was growth. But something in you always knew it wasn't. If this is speaking directly into the place you have not spoken about for years, stay. Because what Carl Jung discovered over a century ago about people exactly like you may be the most important thing you have never been told. And if you've been waiting for someone to finally give you language for what you are, this video is that language. Before we go any deeper, if Jung has ever said something that felt like it was addressed to you personally, like a letter written in a language only you could read, subscribe to this channel and leave a like on this video. What we do here is not psychology as self-help. It is depth psychology as a journey into what you actually are. Join us now. Let us begin. Carl Jung believed something that mainstream psychology has never fully recovered from. He believed that the psyche was not merely a biological mechanism for processing stimuli and producing behavior. He believed it was a living, purposeful system oriented toward something, a wholeness, a completion, a becoming. He called this process individuation. And he believed that among all the people who would be called toward it, the ones who felt most deeply were not the most damaged. They were the most awake. But let us not rush to comfort. The comfort will come, but it must be earned through understanding. And understanding requires us to sit with a harder truth first. The person who feels everything too deeply does not simply suffer more than others. They suffer differently. There is a particular quality to their suffering that ordinary explanations cannot reach. It is not just that they hurt more, it is that they seem to absorb. The grief in a room settles into them. The tension in a marriage that no one is talking about lives in their body. The loneliness of strangers becomes briefly, inexplicably, their own loneliness. They do not choose this. They were never given the option to choose. It was there before they had words for it. Jung, writing from within the framework of analytical psychology, understood this not as pathology but as a particular configuration of the psyche, a psyche unusually thin at the boundary between the personal and the collective. Most people move through life protected by what Jung called the persona, the mask, the social face, the buffer between the inner world and the outer one. The persona is necessary, sis. It is what allows a person to get through a Tuesday. But the deeply feeling person's persona was never quite thick enough. The world came through. It still comes through. And here is what Jung knew. The thinness is not a defect in the construction. It is the construction. To understand what you actually are, not in the sentimental sense, but in the precise Jungian sense, we must first understand what sensitivity means at the level of the unconscious. Jung distinguished between two fundamental orientations of the psyche, introversion and extroversion, yes, but also between what he called sensation, thinking, feeling, and intuition as the four functions of consciousness. What interests us here is the feeling function, not emotion in the colloquial sense, but something Jung described with far more precision. For Jung, feeling was the function by which the psyche assigned value, not analytical value, not instrumental value, but worth, meaning, significance. The feeling function was the part of the psyche that knew what mattered. A person in whom the feeling function is dominant, and this is technical description, not a poetic one, does not simply experience the world. They are engaged with it in an ongoing negotiation of value. Everything that enters the field of awareness is immediately and involuntarily assessed. Does this matter? Is this real? What is the weight of this? This is exhausting in the way that labor is exhausting. It does not stop. It does not take weekends. It runs underneath every conversation, every quiet moment, every night before sleep. And the world, which runs largely on a different logic, the logic of efficiency, productivity, output, the logic of thinking and sensations, does not make room for this. The world says, compartmentalize. Separate the feeling from the function. Leave the meaning at the door. And the deeply feeling person cannot do this. They were never built to do this. And so they arrive at adulthood with a particular wound. Not the wound of having been broken, but the wound of having been misunderstood at the level of what they fundamentally are. This is what Jung called an inferior adaptation, not inferiority in the sense of lesser, inferior in the original Latin sense, placed lower, subordinated. The world had no architecture for what you were, and so what you were was pressed down, covered over, labeled a liability. But the psyche does not accept this arrangement quietly. Jung was very clear about this. What is pressed down does not disappear. It accumulates in the shadow. The shadow. We must speak of the shadow here because it is the center of everything. Jung defined the shadow as the unconscious part of the personality, the aspects of the self that the conscious ego has rejected, repressed, or simply never developed. For most people, the shadow contains the dark impulses, the rage, the envy, the hunger for power that civilization requires us to suppress. But for the deeply feeling person, something else also lives in the shadow. Their shadow often contains their own strength. Think about this carefully. The person who has been told their entire life that they are too much, too sensitive, too emotional, too intense, does not simply suppress those qualities. They suppress their relationship to those qualities. They learn to treat their own depth as shameful. They learn to apologize for their perception. They learn to call their insight over sensitivity and their awareness dysfunction. And so the shadow of the deeply feeling person frequently holds not depravity but power. The full force of who they are that was never allowed to breathe in daylight. Jung understood that the shadow must be confronted, not to destroy it, but to reclaim what was wrongly placed there. The process he called shadow integration is, for the feeling dominant person, often not a journey into darkness. It is a journey into their own abandoned magnitude. It is standing in front of the version of themselves that was told it was too much, and saying, "You were never too much. You were simply in a world too small." But the shadow integration does not happen in one conversation. It does not happen after reading the right book or watching the right video. Jung was emphatic about this. The shadow integration is the work of a lifetime, not a weekend. It proceeds slowly, often painfully, through what he described as the encounter with the unconscious, through dreams, through the irrational, through the moments when life breaks open and the carefully constructed persona can no longer hold. These are the moments the deeply feeling person knows well. The crisis that arrives at 40 and refuses to be reasoned away. The relationship that ends and takes the entire scaffolding of the self with it. The morning when you wake up and nothing you built means what you thought it meant. These are not failures. In the Jungian framework, these are invitations, the psyche calling its own in. Now we must speak of Chiron, because the Jungian concept of the wounded healer cannot be understood without standing before this myth with genuine attention. Chiron was a centaur, half human, half horse, in Greek mythology. But unlike the other centaurs, who were brutish and violent, Chiron was a healer. He was the teacher of heroes. He knew medicine, music, prophecy, the arts of war. He was, in the mythological imagination, the figure who understood suffering from the inside and used that understanding to illuminate the path for others. But here is the wound at the center of the story. Chiron himself was struck by a poisoned arrow that would never fully heal. He was immortal, so he could not die. But he could not recover either. He carried the wound forever, and it was precisely because of the wound, not in spite of it, that his healing capacity was absolute. Jung drew on this myth explicitly. He wrote that the healer's own hurt gives the measure of his power to heal. This is not sentiment. This is not reassurance. This is a structural claim about the nature of depth perception. The person who has been wounded at the level of their essential nature, not merely hurt by circumstance, but wounded in the place where they are most fundamentally themselves. That person, if they do the work, develops a form of understanding that cannot be acquired any other way. Not through education, not through training, not through accumulation of experience. Only through the specific fire of having been broken in a place that still somehow seizes. This is the wounded healer archetype. And it lives in everyone who has ever been told they feel too much and has spent years trying to decide whether that is a curse or a capacity. Jung's answer was unambiguous. It is both. It was always both. But we need to slow down here, because there is a danger in the wounded healer framing that Jung himself was not unaware of. And it is a danger the deeply feeling person must understand, because it is the particular trap laid specifically for them. The trap is this: the identification with the wound as identity. The person who has been told they feel too much can spend decades organized around that wound. The sensitivity becomes the story. The suffering becomes the self. They wear the wound like a seal of authenticity. They find meaning in the pain, rather than moving through the pain toward the meaning, waiting on the other side. Jung observed this pattern with great care. He called it inflation, the unconscious identification with an archetypal role that prevents the actual development of the individual. The wounded healer is an archetype. It is a pattern in the collective, unconscious, a pattern that predates every individual who has ever lived inside it. And archetypes are powerful precisely because they are collective. When you step into an archetypal role, you borrow its power, but you also risk losing your individual face. The pattern is so large, so ancient, so magnetizing that the person can disappear inside it. The wound becomes permanent not because it must be permanent, but because somewhere the person stopped believing they were allowed to be more than their wound. Jung's framework of individuation is specifically designed to address this. Individuation is not the same as living out an archetypal identity. Individuation is the process by which the individual, unique, specific, irreducible, emerges from the archetypal patterns that initially shaped them. The wounded healer is the beginning of the story. It is the entry point. It is not the destination. The destination is something Jung called the self, with a capital S, distinct from the ego, distinct from the persona, distinct from the shadow. The self in Jungian terms is the totalizing center of the psyche, the organizing principle of the whole person, the image of God within. It is what the deeply feeling person has been pressing toward their entire life without knowing it. Every moment of unbearable beauty, every grief that seemed to belong to more than just them, every flash of intuition that landed too precisely to be coincidence. These were not random events in a sensitive nervous system. They were dispatches from the self speaking through the only instrument sensitive enough to receive the signal. You need to understand what your sensitivity actually is at a structural level, not emotionally. Structurally, Jung spent significant energy on the collective unconscious, the layer of the psyche that lies beneath the personal unconscious, beneath the individual memories and repressions at the level of the species. The collective unconscious contains what Jung called archetypes, primordial patterns of experience that all humans share, inherited not through cultural transmission, but through the deep architecture of the psyche itself. The great mother, the hero, the shadow, the trickster, the wise old man. These are not metaphors. They are functional structures. They move in us without our permission. They organize our experience before our conscious mind weighs in. Now, the deeply feeling person has a particular relationship to this layer. Their thin boundary, the quality that made them seem too sensitive, too permeable, too easily hurt, is also the quality that allows them to receive from the collective unconscious more directly than others do. They are more porous to the archetypal layer, more available to its imagery, its weight, its significance. This is why they respond to music in ways that seem disproportionate. The music is not just music. It carries the collective weight of grief, of longing, of the human attempt to approach the divine through organized sound, and the deeply feeling person receives that weight in full, without the filters that allow others to simply enjoy the melody. This is why a stranger's sadness becomes briefly their own. The stranger's sadness is also the collective sadness, a pattern old enough to belong to everyone, and the deeply feeling person, open to the collective layer, receives it. This is not dysfunction. This is a different mode of being in the world, a more expensive mode, one that costs more in daily life, but one that, in the Jungian framework, carries a specific purpose. Jung believed that the individuals who receive most fully from the collective unconscious carry a particular responsibility, not to the collective in the abstract, but to the process of making conscious what is unconscious, to bring to language and form the things the culture cannot yet say. The artists, the therapists, the people who write in the middle of the night about things they don't know how to explain, the people who look at another person's grief and recognize it without being told. You are not a byproduct of oversensitivity. You are a carrier of the culture's unlived interior. Let us pause here and speak to what this has actually felt like inside your life, because the theory is nothing without the lived texture of it. You have probably spent time trying to explain yourself to people who could not receive the explanation. You have tried to articulate why certain things hit you differently, why you need more time alone than seems socially acceptable, why you cannot simply move on, why the ending of something, a season, a friendship, a chapter of life, requires from you a grief that feels genuinely disproportionate to what others observe. You have stood in front of people who love you and felt utterly untranslatable. And here is the specific loneliness of the deeply feeling person that no one talks about clearly enough. It is not just that the world does not understand them. It is that the world does not understand them in a way that causes them to doubt themselves. The loneliness does not stay outside. It comes in. It asks, what if they are right? What if the feeling is too much? What if the problem is not that they cannot receive me, but that I am genuinely, fundamentally flawed in the way I am made? This is the nigredo, Jung's term drawn from the medieval alchemists, the blackening, the first stage of the alchemical opus. In alchemy, the prima materia, the raw material, had to be broken down, dissolved, reduced to its essential components before it could be transformed. Jung saw in this a perfect mirror of the psychological process. The nigredo is the stage of depression, confusion, dissolution of identity. The sense that everything one thought one was has been called into question. It is the dark night of the soul, but understood psychologically, not as God's absence, but as the psyche's demand. For the deeply feeling person, the nigredo often arrives at the point when the performance of normalcy finally breaks down, when the effort of being palatable to a world that was not built for you becomes unsustainable, when the gap between the inner life, enormous, complex, relentless, and the outer presentation, controlled, accommodating, careful, becomes too wide to maintain, something collapses, and the deeply feeling person, because they feel it all, feel the collapse fully. They do not collapse a little. They collapse completely. But Jung was very clear. The nigredo is not the end. It is the beginning. It is the condition of possibility. Nothing can be built in the psyche until the false constructions have fallen away. The person you were performing, the manageable, palatable, appropriately sized version of yourself, had to dissolve before the actual self could begin to emerge. This is why your darkest period was not your worst chapter. It was your first honest one. From the nigredo comes the albedo, the whitening, the washing, the clarification. In the alchemical metaphor Jung used so precisely, this is the stage in which the dissolved elements begin to be separated and seen clearly. What belongs to you and what was placed on you by others begins to disentangle. What you genuinely are and what you were trained to be begins to separate into distinct categories. For the deeply feeling person, the albedo often announces itself quietly, not as a revelation but as a recognition, a moment when you stop apologizing mid-sentence for something you have not yet said, a moment when someone begins to tell you what you should feel and you notice, perhaps for the first time, that you are not receiving the instruction, a moment when you look at your sensitivity and think, this is not a deficiency I need to manage. This is an instrument I have not yet learned to play. Jung described this stage as the encounter with the anima and animus, the contrasexual archetypes that carry much of the psyche's unlived depth. For those in whom the feeling function has been suppressed, this encounter often arrives as the discovery of a different relationship to one's own emotional world. Not emotion as something that happens to you and must be survived, but emotion as information, as precision, as a form of intelligence that, properly developed, is more discerning than rational analysis in the domains where rational analysis has no tools. The deeply feeling person, at the albedo stage, begins to understand that their sensitivity is not a passive condition. It is an active capacity. It can be directed, refined, brought to bear with intention. This is not the same as control. Jung was clear that the goal is never to control the unconscious, but to be in relationship with it. The sensitivity does not become less, but the person's relationship to their own sensitivity changes. They are no longer drowning in it. They are learning to navigate it. This is not a small thing. This is the beginning of the life that was always available to you. We must speak now of something that is not often brought into this conversation, the specific gift that the deeply feeling person carries, that the world desperately needs, even as it consistently refuses to acknowledge that it needs it. Jung believed that Western civilization had made a catastrophic error, not a political error, not an economic one, a psychological one. It had elevated the thinking function above all others. It had organized civilization around rational, measurable, quantifiable reality, and in doing so had severed itself from the imaginal, the symbolic, the emotional, and the sacred. The result was not liberation, but a kind of collective neurosis, a culture that could build extraordinary things and feel nothing inside them, a culture that could explain everything and understand very little, a culture that looked at the deeply feeling person and diagnosed them rather than learning from them. Jung called this the one-sidedness of consciousness, and he believed it was the source of the century's pathologies, the wars, the ideologies, the destruction, the spiritual starvation that lived underneath the material abundance. What civilization had suppressed had accumulated in the collective shadow and was now erupting. Through violence, through nihilism, through the sense of meaninglessness that had become the defining experience of modern life. The deeply feeling person in this framework is not an anomaly to be managed. They are a corrective. They are the part of the culture that is still in contact with what the culture has cut off. Their sensitivity is not surplus. It is the thing the rest of the system is running deficient in. This does not make them special in the way the ego wants to be special. Jung was very careful about this distinction. Identification with a compensatory role, the idea that my sensitivity makes me superior, more evolved, more spiritually advanced than others, is the inflation trap. The shadow of the wounded healer is the healer who becomes addicted to being wounded, who positions their sensitivity as proof of their elevation, who uses depth psychology as a mirror for narcissism, rather than a tool for genuine encounter with the unconscious. The authentic version of this recognition is quieter. It is the recognition that the capacity you carry, the depth, the permeability, the relentless attention to what actually matters, is not yours to possess. It moves through you. It belongs to something larger than your personal story. And your work is not to perform it, or market it, or build an identity around it. Your work is to develop it, the way a musician develops their ear, the way a craftsman develops their hands, until it becomes reliable, precise, and truly useful to the people your life brings into contact with you. This is what Jung meant by the individuation of the wounded healer, not the transcendence of the wound, the transformation of it. There is a dream image that recurs across cultures, across centuries, with remarkable consistency. Jung documented it in multiple forms across his clinical work and in the survey of mythology that constituted the foundation of his theory of the collective unconscious. The image is this: a person standing at the edge of water, not necessarily an ocean, sometimes a still dark lake, sometimes a river moving in a direction they cannot determine. The water is not threatening, exactly, but it is deep. And the person at the edge knows, with the particular certainty that dream knowing carries, that there is something living in the water, something old, something that has been waiting. This is the image of the unconscious calling, and it appears with particular frequency in people at the threshold moments of their lives. Mid-life dissolution, the aftermath of loss, the point at which the persona breaks, and the deeper life begins to insist. Jung wrote about the numinosity of these dreams, the sense that they carry a weight beyond the personal, that they participate in something mythic rather than merely psychological. The deeply feeling person lives very close to this water. They always have. They do not require a breakdown to be brought to the edge. They are already there. They have always been standing where others have to suffer to arrive at. And the water, the unconscious, the collective depth, the living darkness beneath the surface of things, speaks to them in ways they cannot always translate, but cannot mistake for silence. This proximity is the source of their suffering. It is also the source of their knowing. What lives in the water is not chaos. It is not madness. It is the self, the wholeness that the ego cannot construct, only encounter. And the encounter in Jung's framework is the purpose of everything. It is why the psyche builds its elaborate machinery of dreams and synchronicities, and unbearable feelings and dark nights, not to punish, not to test, to guide. To bring the conscious individual into relationship with the totality of what they are. The deeply feeling person has been in this water their entire life, sometimes drowning in it, sometimes swimming, rarely standing still enough on the bank to see it clearly. The work of individuation, the particular work asked of them, is to learn to stand at the edge without either plunging in helplessly or turning away. To be present to the depth without being consumed by it. This is the discipline the world never taught them, because the world did not know it was needed. Let us speak about relationships for a moment, because this is where the deeply feeling person has often suffered most concretely. The world of human relationships, filtered through the Jungian lens, is primarily a world of projections. People do not relate to each other directly, not at the level of the unconscious. They relate to the images they carry, the archetypal templates of mother, father, beloved, enemy, trickster, hero, and they project those images onto the people nearest them. The people nearest them receive these projections and, frequently, live inside them. The deeply feeling person is particularly vulnerable to carrying projections because of their permeability, their openness to the emotional register of others. They tend to absorb the projected emotional content around them and organize their behavior around it. They become skilled at reading what others need and finding ways to provide it. The mother who needs a confidant, the partner who needs someone to hold their unlived anger, the friend who needs someone to name what they themselves cannot name. The deeply feeling person does all of this, often simultaneously, often without anyone asking. And then they wonder why they are exhausted. They wonder why they feel invisible in the very relationships in which they have given the most. They wonder why the giving doesn't seem to close the gap between themselves and others, but only widens it. Jung's concept of the persona is essential here. The persona is the face presented to the world, necessary, useful, but dangerous when confused with the actual self. The deeply feeling person, shaped by a lifetime of adapting to others' needs, often develops a persona of extraordinary competence, the capable one, the calm one, the one who holds it together, the one who understands. And the more sophisticated this persona becomes, the further it drifts from the actual inner life it was constructed to protect. The shadow of the relentlessly giving, deeply perceptive, emotionally available person is often enormous, not because they are secretly monstrous, but because everything they could not afford to be in order to remain acceptable has accumulated there. The anger at years of invisibility, the longing to be met rather than needed, the part of them that wants to stop feeling for other people and start feeling for themselves, the uncontrollable need that they diagnosed in others but never allowed themselves to claim. The individuation of the deeply feeling person requires, at some point, the withdrawal of projections, both the ones they have carried for others and the ones they have cast upon others. This is not a comfortable process. It is, in fact, one of the loneliest processes a person can undertake. Because when the projections are withdrawn, when you stop seeing your partner as the rescuer who should have been, when you stop defining yourself by the need you meet in others, the actual relationship, stripped of its archetypal weight, must be evaluated on its own terms. Some relationships survive this, many do not. But what remains after this process? The relationships that have not merely survived, but have been built on the ground of actual encounter. These relationships carry a quality that the deeply feeling person has been seeking their entire life. They are not held together by need. They are held together by choice. That difference is everything. We have been circling something this entire time, and now we must stand directly before it. Jung said something that the deeply feeling person needs to hear, not as consolation, but as assignment. He wrote, in a formulation that has been paraphrased many times but must be sworn to its original weight. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, not to improve oneself, not to heal oneself, not to optimize or adjust, or finally become the version of oneself that the world can receive without discomfort. To accept oneself completely, the sensitivity and the fury, and the depth and the wound and the enormous, inconvenient, excessive, ungovernable love for existence that has always been the primary fact of who you are. This is the rubedo, the third stage of the alchemical process, the reddening, the stage at which the transformed substance, the psyche that has passed through the blackening of the nigredo and the clarifying of the albedo, takes on its final form. Not the form it was before the process, not the form it imagined it would take at the beginning, a new form, one that has integrated the darkness rather than merely surviving it. One that is recognizable to itself as it was not recognizable before. The rubedo, in psychological terms, is not transcendence. It is not the disappearance of the sensitivity or the wound or the difficulty. It is the point at which the person who feels everything too deeply stops trying to feel less and starts learning to feel truly. The point at which the difference between reactivity and perception finally becomes clear. The point at which the wound and the gift are understood as inseparable. Not conceptually, not theoretically, but in the lived experience of moving through an ordinary Tuesday and knowing, with a certainty that cannot be argued, that everything that made you difficult also made you irreplaceable. There is a question the deeply feeling person often asks, not loudly, sometimes not consciously, but persistently. It surfaces in the quiet after midnight, in the space between conversations that did not quite reach them, in the aftermath of experiences that moved them in ways that left them standing, alone on the other side of it. The question is, why was I made like this? Jung's answer was not a theodicy. It was not the reassurance that everything happens for a reason, or that suffering builds character, or that there is a plan. Jung did not traffic in those currencies. His answer was stranger and harder and more sustaining than any of those. His answer was, because the psyche does not produce unnecessary instruments. If the capacity to feel is present, not as a mild preference but as a primary orientation of the entire psyche, then the psyche has produced it for a purpose. Not necessarily a purpose that announces itself clearly or delivers its rewards in conventional form or is appreciated by the people closest to you, but a purpose nonetheless. The deeply feeling person is not an error in the distribution of human types. They are a necessary instrument in the project of making the collective psyche more conscious of itself. Every time a deeply feeling person holds the grief of another person without trying to fix it, every time they name something true that was living in the room but had no language yet, every time they refuse to simplify an experience that demands complexity, every time they sit with the unbearable and do not turn away, they are doing the work that the culture requires and cannot do for itself. This is not a small thing. It only looks small from the outside. Before we reach the end of this, there is a trait sequence that needs to be named, because the video's title made a promise and the promise must be kept. If you feel everything too deeply, here, mapped against the Jungian framework, are the signs that this is not disorder, but the particular signature of a psyche organized for depth. You absorb atmosphere before information. You enter a room and know its emotional temperature before anyone has spoken. This is not paranoia. This is the feeling function operating at full capacity, reading the collective layer beneath the social surface. You grieve disproportionately. Endings move you in ways others cannot track. This is because you are not merely processing your personal loss. You are receiving the archetypal weight of ending, of the eternal return of departure, of the way loss belongs to the whole human story. You feel it as collective as well as personal. You are exhausted by surfaces. Small talk does not just bore you, it depletes you. Not because you are antisocial, but because the persona to persona exchange, the conversation that exists only to confirm social presence without risk of real contact, uses energy you cannot easily spare. Your psychic system is configured for depth. Shallow water is for you the most effortful kind to swim in. You have an almost involuntary response to beauty. Certain pieces of music, certain landscapes, certain arrangements of light, they do not simply please you. They stop you. They pull something forward from within you that you did not know was there. This is the transcendent function at work. Use Jung's term for the psyche's capacity to experience the numinous, the sense of contact with something beyond the personal. This function is more active in you than in most people. It fires without your permission. You know things you have not been told. You read subtext before text. You understand the difference between what people say and what they mean, not as a skill you developed, but as an orientation you were born with. This is the intuitive function working in concert with the feeling function, not prediction, but deep pattern recognition at the level of the unconscious. You cannot simply move on. When something ends, when a person leaves, when a chapter closes, when a version of yourself becomes untenable, you must process it fully before the new can begin. This is not weakness. This is the psyche's refusal to leave anything unconscious that should be made conscious. The grief is the work. The mourning is the alchemy. You have always felt slightly out of time, as though you arrived in the wrong era, or as though the world around you is moving at a pace and in a direction that does not match what lives in you. This is, in Jung's framework, distraction, the classic experience of a psyche that is more closely connected to the archetypal layer than to the surface layer of the historical moment. You are not out of step with your time because you are broken. You are out of step because you are receiving from a deeper frequency. You hold other people's suffering long after they have moved on. The friend who is fine now, but whose pain from last year you still feel in your body when you remember that conversation. The strangers whose story you heard once and have not forgotten. This is the wound that does not close, Chiron's arrow, and it is also the source of your peculiar, irreplaceable capacity to accompany people through their darkness, without requiring that they perform recovery before you release them. There is one more thing. The most important thing. The thing that belongs at the center of everything this video has been. Jung wrote, and this is as close to a direct address to you as the entire body of his work ever comes, that the greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. This outgrowing, Jung wrote, requires a new level of consciousness, some higher interest arising to alter the problematic situation and make the old problem look different. You have spent years trying to solve the problem of what you are. You have tried to become less. You have tried to become more. You have tried to find the setting on the dial that makes you acceptable to a world that keeps measuring you by a scale calibrated for someone else. You have tried therapy and silence and disciplined surrender and every combination in between. None of it solved the problem, because the problem was never what it appeared to be. The problem was never that you felt too much. The problem was that you were trying to be less of what you are in a world that told you what you are was an error. The outgrowing is this, the recognition that there is no version of you that feels less. There is only the version of you that has not yet understood what the feeling is for. And when that understanding arrives, not as information but as lived experience, as the rubedo that follows the long dark. The problem does not disappear, it transforms. The question stops being, how do I stop feeling so much? And becomes, what do I do with everything I feel? That is the question individuation was designed to answer. Not in a single video, not in a single year, not in a single life lived at the surface, but in the long, difficult, irreversibly transformative process of going down into the psyche and coming back with more of yourself than you had when you descended. You were never too much. You were precisely enough for a world that did not yet know what it needed. If you have arrived here at the end of this, if you have sat with this the way you sit with the things that matter without rushing past them, then you already know that something in this reached you, not as information, as recognition. That recognition is the beginning. It is the moment at which the psyche turns toward itself rather than away. It is the threshold Jungian described as the gateway to individuation, not a dramatic crossing, but a quiet decision. The decision to take seriously what you have always known about yourself. To stop diagnosing the depth as pathology, to allow the sensitivity its full stature. The next step is not mine to give you. Jung was clear on this. The inner work cannot be prescribed from the outside. It must emerge from within, guided by the unconscious itself, through dreams, through what refuses to leave you alone, through the images and symbols that rise unbidden and carry more weight than the day's events. The unconscious knows the way. It has always known. You simply have to be willing to listen in the language it speaks. If this channel has become part of that listening, subscribe. Leave a like, not as a transaction but as a signal to the algorithm that something here deserves to reach the people who need it. There are others standing at the same edge you are standing at. Some of them will find this through you. Next, we will go deeper. Because beneath the wounded healer, there is another archetype awakening in the person who has survived their own sensitivity, one that Jung named with extraordinary precision and that carries the answer to this opened, but could not yet fully close. We will go there together. The work continues.